A 12-year-old boy accepted an impossible challenge that would change not only his life, but the fate of an entire community. When the small orphan boy tamed the most ferocious bull in the country with an ancient song, the powerful rancher refused to pay the promised prize. What happened next will touch your heart. Leave a like and subscribe for more emotional stories like this. The sun rose lazily over Oakwood Ranch that January morning, painting the sky with shades of orange and red that seemed to foreshadow the extraordinary events to come. Michael woke to the crowing of his neighbor Mary's rooster, as he had every day for as long as he could remember. His small hands, already calloused from work, pushed aside the patched sheet as the aroma of weak coffee filled the tiny room he shared with his grandmother. The boy didn't know it, but that would be the last day of his ordinary life. The mud house where they lived was in Hope Village, a cluster of simple homes that had grown like weeds on the edges of the imposing Oakwood Ranch. It was a brutal contrast. On one side, the green pastures and modern facilities of Richard Smith's property. On the other, the dirt roads and colorful little houses where life stubbornly insisted on blooming despite all the difficulties. Michael knew that invisible border between two worlds well. 3 years ago, he had discovered a gap in the fence separating the ranch from the village, and since then, on moonless nights, he would sneak like a shadow to watch the cowboys working with the animals. On that specific morning, while helping Grandmother Elizabeth get out of bed, the boy noticed her hands trembling more than usual. The dry cough that had accompanied her for months seemed to have worsened overnight, and the handkerchief she pressed against her lips showed small red stains she tried to hide. Michael pretended not to see, as he always did, but the weight of that sight settled in his chest like a stone. He needed to do something, anything, but the money for the operation seemed as distant as the stars he saw from his broken window. It was Joseph the baker who brought the news that would change everything. The chubby, smiling man entered the small grocery store where Michael helped on Saturday afternoons, panting, his eyes shining with excitement. Between breaths, he told about the challenge issued by Richard Smith. $1 million for anyone who could ride Storm for 8 seconds. The Black Bull, imported from Texas, had already thrown 17 experienced men in less than 3 seconds each. It was a matter of pride for the rancher, a demonstration of power that fueled his insatiable vanity. Michael listened to every word intently, his hands stopping their work of bagging Teresa's groceries. $1 million. The amount danced in his mind like a mirage in the desert. With that money, he could not only pay for his grandmother's operation, but ensure she had the best treatment, the best doctors. He could even buy a new house, away from the dampness that worsened her condition. Hope, a word his grandmother always repeated in her nightly prayers, sprouted in his chest like a long dormant seed. That night, lying in his narrow bed, Michael recalled every moment he had spent watching the ranch animals. He especially remembered a rainy dawn 3 months ago when he had seen the veterinarian Paul calm a mare in labor by singing a soft melody. It was the same song his grandmother used to hum when he was small and had nightmares, an old tune that spoke of cowboys and herds, of men who talked to animals as if they were old friends. The light of the full moon entering through the crack in the window seemed like a sign, a call he couldn't ignore. The morning of the challenge dawned hot and dry, the kind of day when even the wind seems too lazy to blow. The makeshift arena on the ranch was already buzzing with people when Michael arrived, his heart beating so fast he feared everyone could hear it. Richard Smith was in his element, strutting like a fighting rooster among the important guests who had come to watch the spectacle. His immaculate white suit contrasted with the red dust that was already beginning to rise with the movement of the crowd. The first competitor was John Iron Arm, an experienced cowboy who boasted of never having been thrown in under 5 seconds. Storm made sure to break that record, 2.5 seconds, and John was flying through the air like a rag doll, landing with a dull thud that made the crowd groan in unison. The second tried a different, more cautious approach, but the result was the same. One after another, strong, experienced men were humiliated by the Black Bull that seemed to embody nature's very fury. It was after the 5th competitor was carried out of the arena, moaning in pain, that Michael took his first step forward. The murmur that ran through the crowd was like the buzzing of a disturbed beehive. Some people laughed, others protested. A stout woman grabbed his arm trying to stop him, but he gently pulled away and kept walking. Each step seemed to last an eternity, the dust rising and dancing around his bare feet like small golden whirlwinds. Richard Smith almost choked on the gulp of whiskey he was taking when he saw the boy approach. His face, already red from the sun and drink, turned even more scarlet. The humiliation of having a child participate in his challenge was almost palpable. But there were cameras, there was the local press, there was his reputation to protect. With an irritated gesture, he ordered the papers brought for the boy to sign, certain that the child would give up upon seeing the liability terms. Michael signed without hesitation, his neat handwriting contrasting with the urgency of the moment. Paul, the veterinarian, approached, concerned, recognizing the boy from visits to the community. He tried to dissuade him, spoke of the dangers, of broken bones, of the real possibility of death. But there was something in that child's eyes, an ancient determination that didn't match his young age, that made him back away. It was as if Michael carried with him the wisdom of generations of cowboys, the unwavering faith of those who had learned to dance with danger. When the chute gates opened and Michael entered the confined space with Storm, time seemed to slow down. The bull, which until then had been snorting and pawing the ground furiously, slowly turned its massive head towards the boy. For a moment that seemed eternal. The two stared at each other. The skinny child in his worn clothes, and the mountain of muscle and horns that could crush him with a single movement. It was then that Michael began to sing. The melody flowed from his lips like fresh water on a hot afternoon, the ancient words echoing through the silent corral. It was the song his grandmother had taught him, which her grandfather had learned from his great-grandfather, in an unbroken chain reaching back to the first cowboys who had pioneered those lands. It spoke of respect, of partnership, of men and animals united by work and the merciless sun of the backlands. Storm tilted his head, as if hearing echoes of a distant past where bulls and men were not adversaries, but companions on a journey. The judge, a gruff man who had presided over hundreds of rodeos, hesitated with his hand on the stopwatch. He had never seen anything like it. The boy approached the bull with fluid movements, without haste, without fear. When he finally mounted, it was as if he had always belonged in that place, as if Storm's broad back was the throne he had waited, his whole life to occupy. The signal was given, the gates opened, and the impossible happened. Storm burst from the chute like a controlled explosion, his powerful movements making the ground tremble. But there was a rhythm, a cadence that perfectly matched the way Michael moved. The boy wasn't fighting the bull. He had become a part of it, anticipating every movement, flowing like water over stone. 1 second passed, then 2, 3. The crowd, which had begun counting in a low voice, increased their volume as the seconds accumulated like pearls on a necklace. 5 seconds. The ranch record had already been broken. Richard Smith gripped the fence so hard his knuckles turned white. 6 seconds. Paul, the veterinarian, had tears in his eyes, recognizing the almost mystical beauty of that dance between boy and animal. 7 seconds. The crowd erupted in a single roar. 8 seconds. Michael had achieved the impossible. But the real miracle came afterward. Instead of continuing his display of fury, Storm gradually slowed down, like a hurricane losing strength. The boy slid from his back with the same grace with which he had mounted, and for a moment that would be etched in the memory of everyone present. The great black bull lowered his head in an unmistakable bow. Joseph, the photographer's camera, clicked, capturing the exact instant, the image that would sweep the country and change many lives. The silence that followed was broken by the harsh sound of Richard's voice. "Fraud. The boy drugged my bull." The accusation fell like lightning from a clear sky, fury and humiliation evident in every word. But Paul immediately stepped forward, his professional voice cutting through the rising murmurs. He himself had examined Storm minutes before the event, following all protocols. There was no possibility of interference. What had happened there was something beyond common understanding, something that touched the deepest roots of the relationship between man and nature. The crowd began to stir, voices rising in defense. The boy. Clara, a respected matriarch of the community, was the first to shout, "Pay what you owe, Richard Smith." Others joined the chorus, and soon the rancher found himself surrounded by a tide of popular indignation. His face went through various shades of red before he turned around and marched into the main house, leaving his foreman to disperse the crowd. Michael returned home that afternoon the way he had left, on foot, with empty hands. But something fundamental had changed. News of his feat spread like wildfire in dry straw, and before the sun set, the small mud house was surrounded by curious onlookers. Impromptu reporters with their cell phones, proud neighbors, children with eyes shining with admiration. Grandmother Elizabeth, even in her weakness, smiled as she hadn't in years, the light of renewed hope shining in her tired eyes. But Richard's refusal to honor the bet cast a shadow over the celebration. The man locked himself in his fortress of concrete and pride, ignoring phone calls, messages, pleas. His lawyer, a man with thick glasses and an oily smile, appeared the next day with a document full of clauses and fine print, claiming that minors could not participate in bets, that the challenge was null from the start. It was Marina, Richard's only daughter, who began to turn the tide. The 25-year-old, recently graduated in veterinary medicine and working with Paul at the clinic, had watched everything from the main house porch. Something in the way Michael sang to Storm, the almost supernatural connection between the boy and the animal, had deeply touched her heart. She knew her father better than anyone, knew about the nights he woke up shouting the name of Sebastian, the old foreman who had been like a father to him. Marina began her subtle campaign. She left newspaper clippings on the breakfast table, casually mentioned how other ranchers were commenting on the incident, how Oakwood Ranch's reputation was being tarnished. But it was when she discovered the connection between Michael and Sebastian that the battle truly began. The boy was the grandson of the man who had practically raised Richard, who had taught him everything about life in the country before being unfairly fired in a fit of youthful anger that the rancher had never truly been able to justify or forget. The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the gut. In the following nights, he tossed and turned in bed, haunted by long-buried memories. He remembered Sebastian teaching him to ride, the calloused but gentle hand guiding his own. He remembered the stories told by the fire, the ancient songs. The old cowboy would hum while tending the animals, the same song Michael had sung to Storm. Meanwhile, the story of the boy who tamed the bull gained national proportions. Joseph the photographer's photo went viral on social media, shared millions of times with captions speaking of courage, of David and Goliath, of injustice and hope. Journalists from major outlets began arriving in the small village, turning the quiet life of the place into a whirlwind of cameras and microphones. Michael, at the center of all that attention, remained surprisingly calm. He continued his routine of caring for his grandmother, doing small jobs, secretly visiting the ranch animals through the gap in the fence. But now he was followed by a small court of admirers, children who saw him as a hero, adults who placed hopes for change in him. The weight of this responsibility sometimes made him wake up in the middle of the night, sweating cold. But just hearing his grandmother's difficult but steady breathing was enough to remind him why he had done it all. It was on one of these sleepless nights that Michael heard soft knocking at the door. Cautiously, he opened it just a crack, and his heart almost stopped when he saw Marina standing there, wrapped in a dark shawl, her green eyes shining in the moonlight. She quickly stepped inside, looking over her shoulder as if fearing she was followed. What ensued was a conversation that would change the course of the story. Marina told about her father's past, about Sebastian, about the nights she heard him cry the old foreman's name. She told about the guilt that consumed him, about the pride that prevented him from admitting his mistakes. And then she made a proposal. She herself had some savings. She could help with grandmother Elizabeth's treatment. Michael refused, gently but firmly. It wasn't about the money, not anymore. It was about justice, about honoring a promise made, about something bigger that transcended that bet. Touched by the boy's integrity, Marina promised to keep trying to convince her father. Before leaving on an impulse, she took a small gold locket from her neck, an inheritance from her deceased mother. "Keep this," she said, pressing the object into Michael's hands. "It's a reminder that not all Smiths have forgotten what is right." The brief touch of their hands sent an electric current through the boy's arm, a sensation he would remember for many days. The pressure on Richard continued to mount. Other ranchers, concerned about the image of their class, began to distance themselves. Contracts were canceled, meetings rescheduled. The man who had always prided himself on his power and influence watched his social empire crumble brick by brick. On a particularly hot afternoon, after losing $1 million deal because the buyer didn't do business with men without their word, Richard finally yielded. The meeting was scheduled for the following Sunday, in the same arena where everything had begun. Michael arrived accompanied by his grandmother, who had insisted on being present despite her weakness. Marina and Paul were there, as was a good part of the community. Richard, visibly aged by the past weeks, looked smaller, as if the weight of his wounded pride had compressed him. What happened then surprised everyone. Instead of simply handing over the check and leaving, Richard asked to speak. His voice, usually authoritative and harsh, sounded broken as he began to tell about Sebastian, about the lessons he had received and wasted, about the regret he carried. Tears, dammed up for decades, rolled down his weathered face when he turned to grandmother Elizabeth and asked for forgiveness for what he had done to her father. Forgiveness came in the form of a wrinkled hand resting on his, a gesture of compassion that echoed through the generations. Michael watched everything with eyes too wise for his age, understanding that sometimes it is necessary to tame not only wild bulls, but also hearts hardened by time and pride. The money was delivered, but the story didn't end there. In the months that followed, profound changes swept through both the ranch and the village. Richard, like a man reborn, began investing in the community. A clinic was built, jobs were created. The fence that separated the two worlds was torn down. But the most significant change was the creation of the School of Gentle Taming Sebastian Miller in honor of the old foreman. Michael, now with resources to properly care for his grandmother, became the school's youngest instructor. Under Paul's supervision and with Marina's increasingly close support, he taught children and adults the art of communicating with animals through respect and understanding. Storm, the bull that had started it all, became the living symbol of the transformation, grazing peacefully in the fields and approaching whenever he heard Michael's voice. The romance that blossomed between Marina and Michael, despite the age difference, was like one of those flowering trees that wait for the right season to bloom. It began with furtive glances during classes, evolved into long conversations under the starry sky, and was solidified on the day she found him crying silently beside his grandmother's hospital bed as she fought pneumonia. Marina wrapped him in her arms, and in that embrace was the promise of a shared future. Grandmother Elizabeth's recovery was slow but steady, and on the day she was finally discharged, a party was organized in the village square. Richard, unrecognizable in his new humility, played the guitar alongside the local musicians. Marina and Michael danced under the makeshift lights, the golden locket shining on his neck, returned but never forgotten. Children ran between the tables, and even Storm, brought especially for the occasion, seemed to appreciate the music and joy. It was that night that Paul made the announcement that would crown that journey of transformation. Tests performed on Storm had revealed something extraordinary. The bull had a rare heart condition that made him extremely sensitive to specific sound frequencies. The song Michael had sung, passed down through generations of cowboys, contained exactly the notes that calmed the animal. It was science and tradition intertwined in a dance as old as the relationship between man and nature itself. The legacy of that day in the arena extended far beyond the borders of Oakwood Ranch. Taming schools across the country began to study and implement the techniques developed by Michael. Researchers became interested in the connection between traditional cowboy songs and animal behavior. But for the boy who had dared to challenge a bull and a powerful man, the greatest prize was not the money or the fame. The greatest prize was in his grandmother's eyes when she watched the classes from the window of her new house, built on land donated by Richard. It was in Marina's quiet pride when she saw him teach with patience and wisdom. It was in Richard's outstretched hand when, one ordinary afternoon, he asked Michael to teach him to sing the old song. It was in every child who learned that true strength is not in dominating, but in understanding. And Storm, the great black bull, lived his days in peace, grazing under the shade of the flowering trees, always approaching when the ancient melody echoed across the fields. He became a living legend, proof that even the wildest creatures can be touched by gentleness, that the light of understanding can penetrate even the darkest hearts. Michael's journey teaches us that faith, that word so small yet so powerful, can move more than mountains. It can transform destinies. That hope, when fueled by courage and determination, can bloom even in the most barren soil. That the light we seek outside is often within us, just waiting for the right moment to shine. In the end, we all have our bulls to tame, our 8 seconds of terror and glory. We all carry ancient songs in our hearts, melodies that can calm the beasts we encounter along the way, whether they are flesh and blood or made of fear and pride. The question that remains, floating in the air like the golden dust of that afternoon that changed so many lives, is simple yet profound. And when will you let hope bloom in your desert?